Sometimes when we have those lapses in faith, Christ is going to take us back to where it occurred. Not to torment us, not to make us feel bad, not to belittle us, but to take us back to the place where we were so that He can then take us to a place of His grace and His mercy.
Are you looking for meaning or a word from God that's relevant to your life? Are you searching for a better understanding of who God is? Well, you're in the right place. You found the Gary Talks About God podcast. This is a weekly podcast that comes to you from the pulpit of Red Bank Missionary Baptist Church in Germantown, North Carolina. The podcast is hosted by Red Bank Senior Pastor Gary Sanders. Now let's get ready to take that walk through God's Word with our pastor, teacher, and friend. Hey, he's that guy we call Gary.
We're going to go to John 18, continuing to trace Jesus' final steps in the journey to the cross, and this morning, Lapse of the Loyal. And I wanted to have fun with this morning. And then I thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted to ask for us just to have a time where we share those moments where we have a lapse of judgment. Not the ones that end up bad, but the funny ones, right? Now, I'm going to date myself because there's some of you here who's not going to know what in the world I'm talking about. Something went by through the Facebook feed, the way it does everything. You know you're old or you've been in Winston a long time, if when somebody says, oh, that store's at the mall, and the next question is the old part or the new part, right? Because the new part is no longer new. It's been there decades, 20 plus some years. And that made me think about a time that I had a lapse in my judgment at the mall. The old part that had fountains. And everybody knows, you know where the Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny are outside of Belt? Well, there used to be a fountain there, had a bridge, a nice little bridge over the water. And the bridge was not very big. And so as a young kid, that jump was not very big because the bridge wasn't. And in one of my lapses of judgment, I really thought I could make it across. I really didn't make it across. The funny thing is, I don't remember not making it. I just remember being wet. And it's like, the mom comes out there. How did you get wet? I'm standing in front of a fountain. But what do kids do? I don't know. I was minding my own business, and then I was wet. And the security guard's sitting there going, like, am I ever going to be able to come back to the mall again? And then, you had those other lapses of judgment a little bit more serious. See, you didn't know that you were hiring a serial lapse of judgment person because it moved from jumping across the fountain to breaking people out of hospitals in the middle of heart arrhythmias. And so, I struggle with that. But we have those, right? And thank God, A, I'm alive, and B, Rick is too. But we have those funny stories. But we also have the flip side of that coin. The lapse of judgment that's not funny, where we make a mistake, and we wish we had never made that mistake to begin with. And then we start wondering, oh man, what's going to happen? And then we have those where those same stories, but it's not in the life of maybe work or family, but it's in the stories of our faith, where we have a lapse of judgment and we look around and go, how did I get here? What happened? And we start asking those same questions. How do I get out? How does it get better? Is there any hope? Well, this morning in John chapter 18, what we're going to see is a lapse of faith in one of the most loyal, one of the most devoted, one of the most outspoken of the disciples. And his story this morning is a story for us as well. Beginning in verse 13 and reading down to verse 27. Just as a reminder, this is after the garden. They've arrested Jesus in verse 12, which we said they didn't really arrest him as much as he went willingly. Picking it up in verse 13. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door, so that the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answered the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. This morning, John, as we read through the gospel, brilliantly interweaves Peter's denials with what is the unofficial inquiry of Jesus there in the courtyard of the high priest. And through that this morning, I want us to look at a lapse of judgment and just walk through 3 steps from the beginning to where we end up. But we don't end up in a place that has no hope. We can actually end up in a place that offers hope. And so the first thing I want you to see is this. Lapse of faith can occur to the most committed believer. When we read this story, we need to understand that we are dealing with Peter, a disciple. Peter, a believer in Christ. Peter, who has said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." We're not talking about someone who is not a believer. And that's why for us this morning, I think the story is so poignant, because it speaks to who we are. If you're a believer in Christ, there is... You never want to have this lapse of faith where you deny Christ. You never want to have that lapse of judgment. But there's a little bit of misery loves company, right? And we think, well, if this happened to Peter, it can happen to us. And so it stands as a warning, right? It stands as a warning to us this morning. That we may be the most committed believer, but in a moment of weakness, we can have a lapse of faith as well. And so they come and they arrest Jesus and they're taking him. And it says that Peter is following after him, and so did another disciple who was most likely John, the author of the gospel. And they're leading Jesus to not the Roman authorities yet. They're going to have this kind of unofficial inquiry. And so they lead him to the courtyard of the high priest. And as they are getting there, and John is maybe in front of Peter, John is recognized by the high priest's family and the servant. Maybe he sold fish to them or something. It seems that John's family was maybe a family of note, and so he was known to the high priest. So when they walk into the courtyard, John keeps on going through the gate, and Peter is left standing outside. Now, it probably would have been better for Peter if Peter had stayed outside. But John sees that Peter is not with him, and he goes back over to the servant girl and says, can you let him in? And one of the things that's interesting is the question that the servant girl asked. You also are not one of the man's disciples. She knew that John was one of the disciples. And so she looks at Peter and she asks that question, right? And questions like this frustrate me. You ever ask this question? Where you go, you're not one of them, and you go, okay, I just asked that question. What's the answer supposed to be? You ever ask one of those questions? Where you're not really sure the answer, and you can always tell, because I have to stop and I pause and I think, hold on, let me ask that question again. would have been easier for her to say, are you one of his disciples? Then, okay, I can answer that question. But she asked the question, and she frames it in such a way that the answer would be no. She's expecting him to say no. Are you not also one of the man's disciples, are you? And so for a minute we're thinking, all right, okay, Peter, what are you going to say? And look at what he says. 3 words. I am not. Now, in and of itself, that sentence isn't astounding. That's how, are you one of his disciples? I am not. We answer that all the time. Are you so-and-so? I am not. It's just an answer to us. But we just saw those first 2 words used very, very differently. And so in John's writing, he's drawing our attention to these 2 very different, very emphatic pronouncements. In the garden, they come to arrest Jesus. Who are you looking for? We are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus looks at him and responds, I am. You're not one of his disciples, are you? I am not. And you see the disparity. Jesus saying, yes, I am him. I am the one you are looking for. I'm the one you have come to arrest. I'm the one that you want to, that's going to the cross. I am that person. Peter, are you this man's disciple, the one who is saying he's going to die for your sins? Are you one of his followers? Have you been with him? No, I am not. And here we have Peter, the big burly fisherman. Peter, far be it from you, Lord, that though they all fall away, though all of them, John, you can't trust John? Thomas, I'm not sure, but you got to watch those twins. They're tricky, Jesus. They're going to fall away. The zealot, well, you know how zealots are. They're here 1 minute and then they're gone the next. God, if all of them fall away, I will never fall away. Get behind me, Christ. I've got a sword and I'm going to attack those Romans. I know it's 200 or 300, but I got a sword and I used to fish. I know how to wield it. Watch this. I can get the guy's ear. Peter, cowed by a simple question by a lowly servant girl. Are you one of his disciples? And Peter says, I am not. And in that moment, that lapse of faith happens to the person we might call one of the most committed believers in all of the New Testament. And it speaks to us as well. That there can be times in our lives where the circumstances, Peter he's out of his element. Peter is in the courtyard surrounded by the high priest and everybody, and he's nervous, and that one simple question, are you one of his disciples? If he had said yes, what would have happened? They didn't want Peter, they wanted Jesus. But in that moment, fear gave in, and when fear gives in, the answer to that question is, I am not. But in the moments that we lose our faith, the moment that we lapse in faith, does not distract Christ from his plan. A lapse of our faith does not distract Christ from his plan. Because as you're running through this and you're reading it and you're looking at what's going on, after the denial, John weaves in the questioning to Jesus. And he knows what is going on. He knows what's happening over here with Peter and with John. He knows what is happening around him, but even though Peter has failed once, Jesus doesn't let that lapse of faith in Peter distract him from what he has come to do. And so he's brought before the priest, and he's asked a question. He says, hey, tell us about your disciples, and tell us about your teachings. And so Jesus, the first thing he does, and we saw this last week as well, he takes the attention away from the disciples. He doesn't even answer that question. All right, the question about the disciples was to gauge the size of the following. How many do you have in case something goes wrong? How many should we expect to storm the gates? How many more people do we need to put out there to keep them from coming in? But the second question is a theological question. What about your teaching? What are you teaching? What's wrong? Why do they not like his teaching? Because he has, as we just saw, claimed to be God. This was their major grievance. This was what they wanted to grill him on. Why are you teaching that you are God? Well, simple, because I am. I've already answered that question. But he brings it back to himself, and he says, you've heard me teach. I've preached in the open, I've preached in the synagogues, I've preached on the top of the mountain. There's going to be you don't know this, it would have been great if you had looked down and said, you don't know this, but later there's going to be a section in the Bible called the Sermon on the Mount, where I was out on the mountain in front of everybody, preaching. There's going to be another section talking about the Sea of Galilee, when I was out there on the Sea of Galilee teaching, then I get on a boat and go across because there's so many crowds. I've preached in public. You know what I've been preaching. I'm not preaching a message in public and then going to preach a radicalized message in private. And when he does this, it sounds like he's rebuking the high priest, but and to an extent he is, but at the same time he's asking that he has a fair trial, because this trial is not fair. This trial is not correct. It's not the correct legal process, because in the correct legal process of the trials for the Jewish time, they didn't question the defendant, but they questioned the witnesses first. And so if this was to be correct, they should have called all the witnesses. They should have went and got those 5,000 people who had the fish and the loaves and brought them in and questioned them what they were teaching. What did Jesus teach? The guard doesn't like it, strikes Jesus, and Jesus goes, look, why are you striking me? If what I said is wrong, go get the witnesses. What evil have I committed? And so while Peter over here is saying, are you a disciple? I am not. Jesus is again dealing with the authorities, dealing with his teachings, and he's focused on why he's here. The lapse of faith in Peter does not dissuade him or distract him from his mission. The fact that only John and Peter are there and the other 9 are not doesn't distract him from his mission. There's going to be times when we have that moment of wavering in our faith, that lapse in our faith, and we think, man, I've just, Jesus and his mission now is just, no, it's not. Jesus is going to continue to have his face in this context set to the cross. He's going to continue to go there. He's not going to be distracted by it. And when we have those lapses in faith, and we go and we read the end of the Bible like we did this morning in children's message, where we see the end in Revelation, that's not going to keep Jesus from establishing his kingdom. That's not going to keep Jesus from coming and coming back one day as King of Kings and Lords and Lords. It's not going to. Our lapse of faith will not disrupt, it will not cancel, it will not negate the plan of God. Now, there's kind of a dual-edged sword there. Number one, it means you're not special enough that whatever you're going to do is going to mess up God's plans. I'm sorry to inform you, you're not that special. You're pretty special, just not that special. At the same time, we don't want to go, well, it doesn't matter what I do. That's not correct either. But when we have a lapse in faith, it's not going to distract, it's not going to keep Jesus from his plan. But what do we do, though, when we do that? We've had this lapse. We see that Christ is continuing to go forward. His plan is going to continue to go forward. Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us here. That a lapse of faith does not have to be terminal. A lapse of faith does not have to be terminal. Peter's been given one chance, and we read the story and we think, all right, he's going to get it right the next time. He's going to get it right. So John, after the interrogation there, takes us to the next time. Peter is standing there and he's warming himself, and it says, so they said. So apparently Peter is standing over here and he's warming himself. He's standing by the fire, and the people over here are starting to talk. Is that one of them? Is he a disciple? Is he a believer? Is that? And so there's this noise, and then finally one of them says and looks at Peter and says, hey, are you not also one of his disciples? Are you? And Peter goes, I am not. And we think, all right, we play baseball, so he's got 2 strikes. He's still got 1 chance to get a hit. And then John immediately brings us to the 3rd pitch, where a relative comes up and says, didn't I see you in the garden? So now it's framed now in such a way that last question where the answer would be yes, because it's framed by a questioner who was there, who was witness. But if you've ever seen y'all have grilled, right? Right? Y'all have grilled. Yes. Okay. You use charcoal before gas, right? And a charcoal fire is not a raging fire with flames this high, right? Right? This is yes. Okay. Y'all are asleep this morning. All right. But if you have a wood fire, the flames are this high. So a charcoal fire doesn't give off a lot of light. So the guy he's pretty sure, but he's not 100% sure. Didn't I see you in the garden? He thinks it's Peter. And we think, all right, third time, Peter. Third time. I am not. I mean, John doesn't even record his answer. It just says, Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crows. Thanks to Luke's pen, we're told that Jesus looked at Peter when the rooster crowed. And now we're going, man, Peter, that's 3 strikes. You're out of the ball game. Except he wasn't. Which is why this morning I used the word lapse on purpose. Because a lapse, by definition, is a temporary failure of concentration, memory, or judgment. The very definition suggests it is not a permanent state. And that is true for Peter as well. Real quickly, John chapter 21. One of the interesting things that we see as John is writing, in John 19, he tells us very specifically what type of fire it is. He doesn't say that Peter is just standing beside a fire. He says he's standing beside a charcoal fire. That type of fire, charcoal fire, only appears 2 times in the New Testament, both in John's Gospel. John chapter 18 and John chapter 21. John chapter 21, it's after the crucifixion. It's after the resurrection. It's after he has revealed himself to the disciples. And the disciples are up by the Sea of Tiberias. And we're told it's Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, John, James, and 2 others. So there's 7 disciples. And they're all sitting around. And Peter decides to do what Peter knows what to do. He just says, I'm going to go fishing. They're looking around going, I ain't got nothing better to do. I'm going to go fishing with you. So the 7 of them jump in the boat to go fishing, and they fished all night, and they caught nothing. And I'm not going to sing the song this morning about Peter, James, and John in the boat, okay? Out on the deep blue sea. They fished, and they caught nothing. And day was coming up, and they looked, and someone on the shore says to them, children, do you have any fish? They said no, and they said, hey, throw your net on the right side of the boat, reel it in. And when they start reeling in the catch, in verse 7, says, that disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore said to Peter, it is the Lord. John recognized it. So Peter being Peter, what does Peter do? Quick, let's row the boat back to shore. No, Peter jumps in the water. It's a race, Peter against the boat. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. Look at verse 9. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, bring me some of the fish, and just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, 153 fish. And Jesus said to them, come have some breakfast. He came, he took the bread, and verse 13 gave it to them. They had finished breakfast next to the charcoal fire. Jesus said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And when we get to John chapter 21, and John writes that there was a charcoal fire on the shore, we immediately link it back up to John 18. Because it was by the charcoal fire in John 18 where Peter fails and has that lapse in his faith. And it is John chapter 21, by the charcoal fire, where Jesus comes back to Peter and reinstates him as the disciple. Sometimes when we have those lapses in faith, Christ is going to take us back to where it occurred. Not to torment us, not to make us feel bad, not to belittle us, but to take us back to the place where we were, so that He can then take us to a place of His grace and His mercy. And that's the message that we need to hear this morning. Peter failed in his faith. He faltered. There was a lapse of judgment. And in doing that, he shows us that he was a fallible human with all the insecurities and doubts that goes along with it, just like us. Right? We understand that. We make mistakes. We bobble. We fall. We stumble. We have those lapses of faith that go along with it. And we read Peter's story and we see the silver lining of hope there. That Jesus knew who Peter really was. And there's that silver lining of hope for us as well. Because Jesus knows who we are. And He knows that was not a permanent state, but it was a temporary lapse of our faith. And Jesus wants to take us and lovingly and graciously, just like He drew Peter back to Himself, He wants to lovingly and graciously draw us back to Himself. So that what we see in Peter in John chapter 18 was not the last scene in Peter's life. And what we see in the times that we have a lapse of faith and a lapse of judgment, that it's not the last scene in our life. It does not have to be terminal. Quote, "As serious as his disowning of the Master, so greatly also must we esteem the grace that forgave him and restored him to fellowship and service." And that means both in John's gospel and in our lives that there is hope for the rest of us. When we have a lapse of faith, when we have a lapse of judgment, there is still hope, because our faith is in a gracious and merciful, loving Lord who wants to bring us back into the fold. It is not terminal.
You've been listening to the Gary Talks About God podcast. Are you looking for a church? Well, Red Bank Missionary Baptist Church is a community of believers who exist to glorify God and see transformed lives through the gospel of Jesus Christ. You can find us on the web at www.redbankmbc.com. Also, come visit us on Sunday at 8104 Red Bank Road in Germantown, North Carolina. Did you like this podcast? We put one out each and every week, so don't forget to subscribe. We hope this has been a blessing to you, and we thank you for listening.